Hello, welcome to Indus News Live with me, Usman Lone. We begin this hour with our top story, and that's in the United States, where the House of Representatives is debating rules to impeach President Donald Trump. Lawmakers will debate two articles: abuse of power and obstruction of Congress, and then vote separately on each of them. If the House approves the articles, it would be the third impeachment of a U.S. president in history. If impeached, the matter will be referred to the Senate, which will decide whether to remove Trump from office. The impeachment process was launched in September after an anonymous whistleblower complained to Congress about a phone call by President Donald Trump to Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. The president is said to have pressurized Ukraine into investigating his political rival Joe Biden in exchange for aid. Trump insists he's done nothing wrong. In Iran, the Secretary of the National Security Council says any U.S. Taliban talks without the participation of Afghans will fail. Speaking in Tehran, Ali Shamkhani accused the U.S. of trying to use the situation in Afghanistan to disturb regional stability. He also said that Washington has failed to isolate Tehran in the region. Peace talks between the United States and the Taliban resumed earlier this month, but were paused after an attack at the Bagram Air Base last week. While staying with Afghanistan, and Indus Special Envoy Zalmay Khalilzad held talks on the Afghan peace process with President Ashraf Ghani. Ghani's spokesperson Sadiq Siddiqui says Khalilzad briefed the president on the status of negotiations with the Taliban and the recent meeting in Islamabad. He said Ghani expressed concern about ongoing violence by the Taliban. The president told Khalilzad the Afghan people and government want peace in the country. Both sides voiced hope that a ceasefire will soon take place in the country. The United Nations says an average of 9 children are killed or injured every day in Afghanistan this year. In a report, the global body said in 9 months, over 600 children were killed and over 1,800 injured. The report said data shows an 11% increase in child killings since last year. The situation is largely due to a surge in suicide bomb attacks and clashes between the Taliban and Afghan forces. The UN said even by Afghanistan's gloomy standards, 2019 has been a deadly year for children. Well, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres expressed concern over India's use of force to curb protests against India's citizenship law. The Secretary General pressed India to respect freedom of expression and peaceful assembly. Last week, the United Nations called India's new Citizenship Act discriminatory. Meanwhile, protests continue across India against the controversial law. The Indian government has banned public gatherings in parts of New Delhi. The ban comes after clashes between protesters and police in New Delhi's Salimpur area. 6 people have been killed in the protests since last week, and thousands have been arrested. Well, in a related development, the Indian Supreme Court has issued a notice to the government seeking clarification over the citizenship law. The court is hearing 60 petitions against the law. During a hearing, the court sent a notice to the government asking it to publish the act for the public. The court adjourned the hearing until next week. Petitioners argue that granting citizenship on religious basis goes against the Indian constitution. The petitioners asked the Supreme Court to declare the new law as unconstitutional. Meanwhile, Pakistan's minority Hindu community rejected India's offer to grant them citizenship under a new law. New Delhi's law offers citizenship to minorities from neighbouring countries. The Hindu Council said Pakistan's Hindu community unanimously rejects this bill, which is dividing India on communal lines. It said a true Hindu will never support this legislation. Pakistan's Sikh and Christian communities have also strongly rejected the bill, terming it against human rights. Pakistan's Army Chief General Qamar Javed Bajwa says the military will never let anyone destabilize the country. Bajwa said this during his visit to the Special Services Group headquarters in Tarbela. He said the armed forces have defeated all inimical forces operating across the country. He added the SSG made great contributions towards the defense of the country. In Syria, a car bomb kills 4 people and wounds several others in Ras Al Ain near the border with Turkey. The Turkish Defense Ministry blames Kurdish fighters for the attack. Earlier, 24 people were killed in Syrian airstrikes in Idlib. The Syrian Civil Defense said women and children are among the dead. According to the United Nations, over 600,000 people have been killed in the fighting since 2011. Now, the Turkish Foreign Ministry warns Washington's decision to lift an arms embargo on Cyprus will be a dangerous escalation. It says arms supply would hamper efforts towards a dispute settlement on the island. Cyprus has been divided since 1974, when Turkey invaded it in response to a coup engineered by the then military regime in Greece. In 1987, Washington imposed the embargo to encourage a settlement between the Greek majority and Turkish minority. But yesterday, the US Senate voted to end the embargo on the island as part of a large defense spending bill. Moscow and Berlin denounced US sanctions against the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline that will link Germany with Russian gas. Earlier, the US Senate passed a defense policy bill which includes curbs on companies building the project. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said the move violates international law. He said that the project will be completed on time, and Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel also opposes the sanctions, saying the curbs have extraterritorial effect. After years of delay, NATO will receive its second US-made Global Hawk drone tomorrow. The alliance aims to have 5 Hawk drones in its surveillance system, which will be fully operational by 2022. NATO says the drone system will be the world's most advanced, and it will give NATO 24-hour near real-time surveillance of land and sea beyond its borders. An official said the alliance is attempting to create a small air force. Now to Europe, and in France, transport and public services still remain disrupted as strikes against the government pension reforms entered their 14th day. Hundreds of thousands of protesters took to the streets in cities across the country as protesters refused to accept the government's decision. This report has more. From Eiffel Tower operators to doctors, the strikes have drawn French workers from all sectors of the economy. Protesters are demanding the government take back its pension reforms that ask them to retire later or face reduced payouts. But the government says it won't back down from its plan. Speaking in Parliament, Prime Minister Edouard Philippe said the reforms will be turned into a bill by January 2020.
We've clearly stated what our project is, and on this project, on the creation of a universal pension system, my determination, that of the government and that of the entire majority, is total. I am saying this clearly, total.
Police fired tear gas to disperse the protesters in central Paris, but demonstrators are determined to continue the strike until their demands are met. Even pension chief Jean-Paul Delavoye's resignation could not calm their anger.
If we accept a Christmas break, then we're stopping the strike. If we don't strike, then Macron is passing his reform, since he said he's passing it in January. So, we have to stop him. We have to be logical. People didn't strike for about 15 days just to stop and say, no, let's go see Santa Claus.
French trade unions have called for a major push before the holidays, urging workers across all sectors to go on strike and join the countrywide protests. In Sudan, it's been a year since the people of Sudan started protesting for the removal of former dictator Omar al-Bashir. The ex-president was recently found guilty on corruption charges and sentenced to 2 years in detention. Sudan's now looking for a new start, but its economy is still in recession because of US sanctions. More in this report.
Sara Al-Fateh runs a cooking oil factory in Khartoum. She spends most of her day at a factory and has a crew of dedicated workers. But she's struggling to keep the business running because she cannot order replacement parts for her machines. Al-Fateh blames American sanctions for the problem.
We can't make further investments on spare parts because we cannot open a bank account without a letter of credit because of the American sanctions.
Washington imposed a trade embargo on Sudan in 1997 over the state's alleged links to Al-Qaeda. The curbs affected Khartoum's access to international banking networks, as well as trade in technology and spare parts. The sanctions were eventually lifted in 2017, but the country is still on Washington's state sponsors of terrorism blacklist.
Absolutely no transfers are made from a bank inside Sudan to a country outside Sudan in a convertible currency, whether in dollars, sterling, euros, dirhams, or the Saudi riyal. Nothing. There is never any transfer done through the banking system.
In today's post-Bashir Sudan, inflation is hitting 60% and the country's foreign reserves are empty. The country's civilian-appointed Prime Minister, Abdullah Hamdok, visited Washington, D.C. in December and asked for Sudan to be removed from the blacklist. But this won't happen until the U.S. is assured Bashir's regime is dismantled. As such, post-Bashir Sudan is off to a rough start.
Now in Malaysia, the Kuala Lumpur summit kicks off today and is being attended by leaders from Turkey, Iran and Qatar. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan arrived in Malaysia today to take part in the summit. Indonesia will be represented by Foreign Minister Retno Marsudi after Vice President Maruf Amin cancelled his scheduled visit. The summit aims to address issues of concern to Muslim countries. Well, we'll be back with more news from around the world right after this short break, so do stay with us. Hello again, it's good to have you back. Now in Panama, 13 inmates died in a prison shootout with 15 others injured. Officials said they recovered 3 AK-47 assault rifles and 5 pistols from the scene. Police say the shooting occurred in a cell block where inmates from the same gang were held. President Laurentino Cortizo said an investigation would be launched into how the guns got inside the prison. Officials said no prisoners escaped during the incident. Now in other news, it's been a tough year for Somalia. The country was hit by a drought at the start of 2019, which was immediately followed by the worst floods in the country's history. The environmental disaster has displaced over 180,000 people. This report has more. In early 2019, Maka Abdi Ali's goats were dropping dead from thirst. The struggling shepherd would hope for rain every day. But when she finally got her wish, nature proved unmerciful once again.
The recent drought claimed 64 of my goats, only 7 remained for me. But later I sold them to survive. Now I don't have anything.
This arid country in the Horn of Africa has always struggled with a tough environment. Erratic rain patterns and droughts are a constant feature of life here. But weather-related catastrophes are now occurring with greater frequency and intensity. This has had serious consequences for Somalia, which has already been ravaged by years of war.
All farmlands near this town were swept by floods. Local businessmen's inventories were destroyed, and farmers who used to grow vegetables, fruits and cash crops were also hit badly.
In May, the UN launched a drought appeal, warning that Somalians were facing mass starvation. Now it's asked for help again, saying it needs $72 million to distribute aid to over 500,000 Somali flood victims. But government officials say most of this money will likely be wasted on short-term solutions.
It's a shame that international donors spend $50 to $60 million on emergency humanitarian services every time, while it would be better to spend only a few million on long-term solutions, like building a dam.
$5 million, $6 million, $7 million.
100,000 of the 180,000 internally displaced persons still can't return home and remain stuck in makeshift camps. Meanwhile, the UN says over 200,000 of those affected by the floods still haven't received any aid whatsoever. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, Doctors Without Borders say nearly 700,000 people have been displaced by violence this year. In a statement, the group said the displaced people are now living in camps or with host families. It said over 10,000 children are suffering from malnutrition and over 2,000 were targets of sexual violence. The agency said it has treated twice as many victims of sexual violence as last year. The northern Kivu province is one of the most dangerous zones in Africa's Great Lakes region. Militia groups have controlled much of the province since the Congo civil wars of the 1990s. Now, Australia has recorded its hottest day as the mercury rose to a record high of 40.9 degrees Celsius. The new record may not last long, however, as forecasters predict a heat wave later on in the week. The weather agency said the previous record of 40.3 degrees Celsius was set in January 2013. The record comes as the nation battles a severe drought and bushfire crisis. Prime Minister Scott Morrison's government has been criticised for its response to the fires and its climate policies. Well, a staggering 8 million tons of plastic ends up in the world's oceans every year. Much of it finds its way into the ocean from canals and rivers. But now a local company in Amsterdam is working to remove plastic trash hidden under the city's waterways. More in this report.
Plastic waste, whether in a river, ocean or on land, can persist in the environment for centuries. According to a German environmental research company, rivers are carrying up to 4 million metric tons of plastic into the sea each year. In Amsterdam, bubble barrier technology is being used to remove the plastic from its canals.
The Great Bubble Barrier is an idea that also can catch plastics which it's under the water surface, and also the smaller pieces which the boats don't get.
The company claims the bubbles don't interfere with passing boats and don't pose any danger to fish or birds.
A bubble barrier is basically a tube that we place on the bottom of a river or canal. It has holes in it and we press air through it, and that creates a bubble curtain like you see behind me. The air brings plastics that are floating in the water to the surface, and because we place it in an angle, it redirects the natural flow of the river and the plastics that are in there to the side where we collect it and where it can be removed.
The United Nations says people need to improve the management of plastic waste.
Less plastic is flowing out to the North Sea, and otherwise we also want to give insight into the total plastic problem, because the best is of course that no plastic falls into water in the first place.
The company launched the Bubble Barrier project last month after a small-scale test. If the project is successful, they have planned to deploy it in other parts of the country as well.
In other news, Saudi Arabia is organising a falconry festival meant to raise awareness on the preservation of the birds of prey. The festival hosted a record-breaking 2,350 falcons, with teams from the UAE, Kuwait and Bahrain participating in the sport. More in this report. Humans have been using falcons to hunt since 2000 BC. Arab Bedouins once relied on these animals to catch meat in the winter. But such an exercise is no longer necessary, as falcon racing has emerged as a popular sport in the Arabian Gulf.
Now in the Gulf, we have in large part some of the best falcon breeders in the world. Thank God and their acquisition of the best species, whether from the UAE or across the Gulf. Today, Gulf states are embracing distinct rare species from around the world.
Apart from being culturally significant, breeding for falcon racing also prevents these animals from going extinct. Raising awareness about the preservation of these birds of prey is one of the reasons the King Abdul Aziz Falconry Festival was organized.
With falcon races, we can stay away from hunting these wild birds, while at the same time, we can use it to increase their numbers. This race in itself is a form of education for falconers, so they leave wild birds alone where they belong, and we use farms to produce birds for these races.
This year's festival broke the world record for most birds to participate in a race. 2,350 birds were put up against each others in this year's contest, with the previous record standing at only 1,723. Riyadh has also created nature reserves with bird farms to further boost falcon numbers. Fascinating. Well, we'll be back with news from the worlds of business and sports right after this short break. Welcome back. Now in business news, car manufacturers Fiat, Chrysler and Peugeot have agreed to a $50 billion merger deal. This will pave the way to create the world's fourth largest car manufacturer. The merger aims to cut production costs of over $4 billion with technology sharing between the two firms. The two firms have not yet given the new company a name. PSA CEO Carlos Tavares will become the new chief of the merged business for an initial 5 years. While Japan's exports have slipped in November, the country's official data reveals exports fell about 8% year-on-year. Declining shipments to the US and China resulted in the longest period of failing exports since November 2016. Japan's trade balance posted a deficit of 82 billion yen. Earlier this month, the country unveiled a $122 billion stimulus package to help the economy. Now to the stock markets, and stocks are trading flat as Wall Street tried to extend its winning streak to 6 days. However, FedEx plunged after it cut its annual profit forecast for the second time this year. The S&P and Nasdaq both hit intraday all-time highs, gaining a fraction each. The Dow Jones is also trading marginally higher. Meanwhile, in Europe, markets traded mixed following UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson's vow to block an extension of EU trade talks beyond next year. Well, it's 11 degrees here in Lahore, but let's take a look at the weather around the world. Well, that's all from me and the team here in Lahore. Headlines are next, and don't forget, for the latest updates on all of our stories, you can follow us on social media at Indus.News. Thank you for watching, and bye-bye.